therapy. And these flashlights, one is very topical. It's from the election of our neighboring province in Upper Austria. And there is a party which only has one program. They are against vaccination, and they are represented in the regional parliament. They achieved more than 6%. Another flashlight from France. Here you have the vaccination obligation for health staff. In Mühlhausen, there is an emergency operation. More than 150 persons had to be suspended because they did not want to be vaccinated. In Germany, there is no payment for unvaccinated persons when they are in quarantine. In Austria, we have discussions about the 3G rules at the workplace, and there is a lot of rules and regulations on a national and regional level, and they lead to confusion. So I would like to welcome everybody who is represented and listening in the live stream. Democracy and freedom in Europe is tested, and there are very strong interferences with freedom, which has been considered normally up so now. The society is changing, the society is drifting apart. There are demonstrations supported by political parties and also accompanied by fake news. And we would like to discuss that in our plenary session. And there's also a strange fact in Austria. There is a politician of a national party who has proven last week with an antigen test and he has proven that he is not vaccinated. This is also leading to strange facts. But before that, I would like to ask Mrs. Siegl. She is from the Opinion Research Institute, Peter Hajek, and the question is, how does Austrian democracy work? And how are people satisfied with the measures and with the decisions? Thanks a lot for the invitation. I will present you now an inquiry project of Peter Hajek. We wanted to analyze the attitude of Austrians towards democracy and how it has changed in three crises. We start with the financial crisis 2009, then there is the refugee crisis 2016, and the COVID crisis in the year 20 and 21. We made a lot of surveys. The survey of this year 21 has been conducted by Peter Hajek and myself. Last year it was made by Peter Ullran. He is referring to a Spectra survey and the years 2009 and from the 90s, which we will also consider, have been made by GfK Austria, where Peter Unger worked. Well, our survey was a method of telephone and online surveys, and last year we also used this combination. Before that, it was mainly a telephone survey. We asked people older than 16 years. We had between 800 and 1,000 participants. Last year it was 800 participants, and so the maximum deviation in this survey is a plus minus 3.1 and 3.5% depending on the participants. And we made this survey at the end of April. Now let's talk about the core question of our survey. There are different opinions concerning democracy, dictatorship. Where do you agree? We had 3 answers. 83 answered democracy is in any case better than a dictatorship. You see the graph, 8% said under several circumstances a dictatorship can be better than a democracy. We call them authoritarian. And 4% said for people like me, it doesn't matter at all if I'm living in a democracy or a dictatorship. We called them the foreigners, people who are quite far away from the political system in certain situations because they are in a difficult situation and they have the feeling that the political system cannot assist them. And then we asked the ones who wanted dictatorship and the ones who did not care. And we found out that 12% is the so-called authoritarian potential. How do they look like? Well, here you see some subgroups which are all sometimes overlapping: young people below 30 years, people who have not a very good education, people who do not go to elections, and also voters for FPO. Then we have two other questions. How satisfied are you with the functioning of democracy? People who were not satisfied have up to 20% a quite authoritarian attitude. And people who think democracy is not able to solve problems in Austria have an authoritarian attitude up to 46%. So this is a key question. When do you think that democracy can solve the problems in the country? Another interesting detail was the self-estimation of people who consider them to be part of a leftist or a rightist party, but also in the middle we have 7%. So there are also authoritarian attitudes in the leftists. Leftist attitude. How did democracy awareness develop in three crises? We started in the 90s, which is called the pre-crisis years. These were 10 years where we did not have a very significant crisis, but the first development of a crisis started. So people were not satisfied with the two big parties. It meant the development of the FPO, first questions discussing migration. And then the green line are the Democrats, and the red line is the authoritarian potential. And you see at first sight that these curves are quite stable. We could think that big crisis is changing this attitude, but that's not the case. So attitude towards democracy, towards dictatorship is a very stable one and cannot be changed easily. When you have a big crisis, people are not running to authoritarian movements. The next curve shows you more fluctuation. Here we have the question, do you think that democracy is able to solve problems in our country? Here you see more reactions to crisis, and you see in the refugee crisis 2015, we had a lot of people saying democracy is not able to solve problems in the economic, and in the COVID crisis we had quite good values. Maybe this is a surprise at first sight, but we understand when politics are giving the feeling that they actively protect people against the crisis, then people have a good feeling. Remember the economic and the financial crisis. Here we had short time working. In the COVID crisis we also had short time working. We had financial support, and we also had lockdowns, which were a strong restrictions where you could imagine that people are not satisfied. But on the other side, people had the feeling that politics or the government is trying to protect myself against a crisis. The next is showing the two questions together, and we have formed types. The confident Democrats, these are people who think democracy is better than dictatorship and democracy is able to solve problems. These are the three green graphs. The yellow column are the very Democrats that people think better is better than dictatorship, but democracy is not able to solve problems in the country. And you saw that in the refugee crisis, these were 22%. This is quite a problem, because when a situation like that is lasting longer, when people think that democracy cannot solve problems, then of course for some they might start with authoritarian potential. At the end, let's see this democratic attitude in different countries. The first is United States. Then we have the G7 countries and Austria. In the United States, you have 78% of people who think democracy is better than dictatorship. And in the G7 and in Austria, it is 83%. That also means Austria is more or less in the middle field of Western democracies, and they are more or less having the same results. Now, the conclusion, we can say there is a consolidated awareness for democracy, which is also stable in times of crisis. Not every crisis is automatically leading to doubts or dissatisfaction. It depends on the reaction of politics, and if politics can show people that they really do something in order to protect people against the crisis and the consequences. Or during the refugee crisis, many had the feeling that politics is more or less overwhelmed by the events and they are not able to react appropriately. Then people are more dissatisfied. And finally, there is an authoritarian potential of approximately 10%, which is quite stable over the years and which is also existing in other democracies in that size. Of course, I will answer your questions with pleasure. Mrs. Siegl, thanks a lot. Please have a seat in our panel. Thanks for this very good explanation with figures. It sounds not so bad. It sounds good. I think the Austrians say not bad. The optimist says this sounds good. Well, but let's ask a question to the politicians on the panel. The question, how do you consider the restrictions of freedom and democracy? There was the worry sometimes that pandemic could be used to restrict freedom and democracy in the long run. These are probably the 12% who have an authoritarian potential. Now I would see it different. I think the authoritarian potential wants a strong person, a strong man who is not depending on parliamentary rules, but who can just decide very quickly. So these persons want to be apart from democracy. In the pandemic, people, when we just think about this new party in Upper Austria, which is against vaccination, people who vote for that party think that there are anti-democratical measures during the pandemic, and they want it should be more democratical. Things like lockdown could not just be decided, but we should go back to democracy where it's not possible to have these emergency rules. Well, I wouldn't say that these people are authoritarian. In their election programs, there is something else. They want more democracy, and they criticize that corona management is not democratical. Commissioner Hahn, maybe you can say this from the point of view of the European Commission, freedom and democracy. Did the European Union see it as a restriction, Well, it's important to state that this form of an international crisis, and it is an international crisis, was surprising everybody more or less. In our headquarters in Parliament, we have a lot of plans how we evacuate people, but we did not have a plan that a virus is just penetrating. And I think this was typical for all Europe. We had no plans, we had no preventative measures. But there was, in summer 2019, there was a project of a plan to cope with these plans. And there was also the transition period, new commission, new parliament. It was decided to look at it at a later time, but we see that things can happen very quickly. But, well, the legal report or the report of state of law has shown that the rule of law existed also during the pandemic. There were countries which had very sophisticated emergency rules, but which were always confirmed in parliament. Well, I understood in Austria we should, of course, do more in that respect. But the problems of the state of rule of law, which we have in some countries, are independent of this present situation. Well, in general, I would say Europe has been criticized that we reacted too slowly. Well, we can discuss several things, but at the end it has been shown when we look at the growth rate, especially during the last quarter, we were even better than China and the United States. When we have a tradition in Europe that individual freedom is very important, Mr. Haslauer said in his introduction, this tension between freedom and control restrictions, well, this discussion is existing only in Europe, or especially in Europe, and I'm happy that we have this discussion. It is also showing our model of life, confirming our model of life. Others might admire the quick Chinese reaction, but there people are controlled for 150%. Every step is controlled, also private steps, and that's not a model we want or we would like to accept. And so I think we have to understand why some measures were taken not so quickly, but it's the result of this of course, combination of democratical processes and measures which were necessary in order to protect the health of the citizen. At the end, Europe has shown that we can handle that quite well. The problem is only we are at the beginning, we are not really, we do not know our self-estimation. At the end, we can estimate ourselves, but not at the beginning. But we should start with the spirit to value ourselves, to estimate ourselves. And maybe we would be quicker when we solve problems within the tension of democracy, freedom, and required measures. Another question, 27 rules and regulations, 27 countries. Is this the European spirit, or the virus cannot read, but it can be contagious? Yeah, but also here, well, we can discuss about that, but why is that like that? But health policy, health issues are a national competence. And when you look at the Austrian situation, and not only the Austrian situation, very often it's not national in the implementation. It is even on a on a regional level, on a local level? Well, during the analysis now, we will have to consider if we have to do something on a European level, but I'm a little bit careful, but especially when we think about the crisis, for example, mutual purchase of equipment, yes, on a European level, but the decision when what should happen should be made on a national level. What I want as a citizen, well, a more uniform reaction on epidemiological appearances and issues would be preferred. The virus is the same in 27 countries. When the effects are the same in the different countries, then I think everybody would expect that the reactions, how to deal with that virus, are the same, and this was missing. And this is still missing and is still leading to a certain irritation. But at the end of the day, we talk about subsidiarity. And I think this luxury, this positive luxury of subsidiarity should be accepted. You are also a minister for the constitution. How do you see this from an Austrian point of view, to come from the European to a national level? I am the minister for the European constitution, and the figures of Mrs. Siegl just give me an optimistic feeling. We have a great pool of stable Democrats. And I think we should also acknowledge that in a positive sense. We have also seen during the crisis, when we have a uniform attitude, when you have a mutual attitudes across party borders, as it was the case at the beginning of the crisis, then people are more willing to follow these measures. This is also according to my experience. In the first lockdown, people also observed the lockdown, but I would like to contradict a little bit. Democratically, there can be a quick reaction. We had a session during the weekend when we had the first COVID rules. All laws were decided not with an emergency law, but they were accepted in the parliament, and this is important for me as a minister for constitution, and this is important for democracy. But as a minister for European constitution, yes, you are right. The virus doesn't speak a language. The virus is contagious everywhere. There might be mutations, but it did not affect all countries in Europe at the same time. I was in Stockholm in February 2020, and in an institution of ACDC, and I asked this specialist how big is the risk for the virus in Europe, and the answer was not very high risk if we just stick to certain hygienic measures. This, of course, confirms what Commissioner Hahn said. We were not prepared. We had a few cases somewhere in Europe. ACDC was already stating these cases, but well, the virus affected especially Italy, and our advantage was what happens if we do not react so strictly at the very beginning. And then we had this uniform attitude. Then we could just approach people, and we coped very well with the first wave. Then this attitude was decreasing because the discussion in Parliament got livelier. One party wanted to take advantage of this situation. There new parties were forming. For example, this new party in Upper Austria, the only program of which is being critical towards vaccination, though there is a potential of conflicts now, and communication is very important, because now this, of course, can also nurture some strange opinions. Last week we had a session in Europe. We were talking about the vaccination rate in other countries, and there Denmark has more than 80%, also among young people. And I asked the colleague, what do you do differently? And that was the answer. Also people in the public, also the political parties do not are not against each other. Nobody wants to be proud that he's not vaccinated and being against vaccination, but everybody says we are in the same boat. When we are all vaccinated, then we don't need measures. Nobody wants to restrict freedom. We have the human rights in Europe. Of course, we always have to find a balance between basic rights, basic freedom and measures. So my answer is the more uniform we work, the more people will just but on the other side, we have quite a difficult climate now to get more vaccination.
May I just ask, at the beginning, the parties kept together, and why then not, as I said, step by step, just remember the values of the government increased, consent increased, so that opposition parties are not quite satisfied with that. And then a situation started that there was this political dispute. I don't want to mention the parties, but everybody could observe that. Some said the restrictions are too much and no fines if somebody does not comply with them. Sorry for interrupting you. That, of course, includes the thought that politics is to be blamed for. At least one party, I think, is striking here, and that is a problem when we have this problem of protecting the population, and that is the popular Austrian party. And it's also the party Naprost, which with a horrendous rate is being introduced in the regional government. Gašper Dovžan, State Secretary and the Foreign Minister of Slovenia. You represented the country in the presidency of the EU. You see this focus also advocating a union which focuses on law of state and equal status for everybody. Thank you very much. As everybody, I think, Corona, of course, has put to a test democracy and the standards. I think every state within the constitutional framework in their way responded to that, and we can learn from each other in Europe. The Commission also, in this year's report on the state of law, also focused on the measures of the states to fight against the propagation of COVID-19, to analyze that. And as I said before, we've seen that, of course, it's very difficult in some countries where the society is polarized and where the situation is also utilized, is exploited. So the struggle against the pandemic is, of course, very difficult, and it's difficult that the people accept it and implement it. In the European Union, it was shown, I think, that very quickly one found a way to establish this internal market. The crisis situations at the borders were solved, and later on it was seen we were quite successful with the procurement of the vaccine material. In Europe, it's not only for the member states that were supplied with vaccines, but other states as well, and I think that helps a lot to establish normality with all the freedoms, not only in Europe, but also outside of Europe. Furthermore, with COVID and the digital certificates, this free traffic of persons was made safer, and in the meantime 44 states have got together, and this of course contributed to create the new normality. I think this is something we have to be proud of. Maybe people do not consider this, but also other states which do not have such a democratic system and were not so successful in obtaining these goals. But we could say that the beginning, of course, was difficult. We were all confronted, were faced with restriction measures at various levels of governance, but ways were found to communicate with each other and to exchange opinions. And then, locally or regionally or on a state level, decisions all were also taken and also at the European level. And today, with more than 70% of vaccinated adults, we're the best all the world over. And this way back to normality, of course, is faster than we thought maybe a year ago or a couple of months ago. It is faster than we had wished a few months ago, but there is still a lot to do. But basically, we have to estimate that democracy was not abolished. Ways were found with certain limitations to live with certain limitations, and research also has shown that support for democracy is still in place, although there are also models that are maybe more efficient, but for the people in Europe are not still not attractive. I think that's quite important. Keyword effective. This open dialogue has this title, Democracy and Freedom in Europe After Corona. You are in the country of the EU presidency. When is your presidency a success, a political successor, with a view to this panel? First, during summer we've succeeded in organizing physical meetings. The European Union has found a way back to normality. The political model works more or less normally, and that's a great success. And then, of course, the vaccination rate, of course, it has to be improved. We have to exchange our opinions. As far as the third vaccination is concerned, we also have to exchange our opinions. What are the 3G measures and what are the consequences for the people? What are the restrictions are justified? And there is still this in the future we have to be prepared better, and we're very active and prepare ourselves so that the Council draws conclusions this pandemic, and from a reactive community, we get into an acting communicate, so that we can agree what is to be done on a European Union level, vaccine procurement or protection, protective equipment. This could be done on a European Union level. To decide what has to be done or on a national and regional level. So these coordination mechanisms where exchange is being done regularly. The extension of the health union is underway, and also the Commissioner could maybe report more. We also see that in the Council it's advancing. The European Health Union is being established, and the mandates of the health agencies are increased. We still have hope here that in the European Parliament agreement will be found, so that also HERA, this new agency for the prevention and response measures in the health sector, can be established. If we advance with these plans, I think, then of course the French are there, and we have mastered our task. Thank you very much. Mikuláš Dzurinda, from 1998 to 2006, Slovakian president. Slovakia led into European Union and NATO. You're head of think tank of the European People's Party. What is your position in the question of restrictions of freedom and democracy during the pandemic? Ich danke Ihnen schön. Das erste,
gathering. I'd like to thank France for my old friend for being invited. And also, this is very nice to meet my old friends, especially Johannes and Karoline, but also all of you here in this beautiful green city. And to your question, maybe I will add nothing new, what especially Johannes Hahn has already said. This is a huge lesson learned, this pandemic. And the more I think about that with my friends in the think tank, in the Martens Center, the more I realize that there is a fantastic instrument which should be used even more than so far. Subsidiarity, Johannes mentioned that, maybe Caroline as well. Subsidiarity. Now we follow the debate, the conference on the future of Europe. I strongly believe that the COVID-19 pandemic and the lesson learned from the pandemic will shape the discussion and especially the conclusions. Yes, not everything was fine, but I cannot imagine to anticipate such crazy crises as the worldwide spread of virus. I cannot imagine. But we have to cope, we have to be clever, responsible, and to adopt conclusions and the measures. First of all, I believe that we need something like comprehensive contingency plans for pandemic emergency to make us less vulnerable in the future, less surprised or shocked than we were in this time. And then we should try to implement the subsidiarity principle as good as possible. I was positively shocked how our municipalities and regions are able to channel all capacities necessary for the pandemic. This was for me a very, very positive surprise. At the governmental level, it was maybe not so nice, especially when it comes to restrictions, because the government, every government had to adopt very unpopular, sometimes controversial measures or decisions such as curfew lockdown, border restrictions, everything bad. So maybe there is only one new word which I can bring to the discussion, and this is leadership. Yes, look, it is necessary to tell people that freedom has also its limits. Also today, it is possible to expropriate property or to nationalize property under three conditions. If it is in the public interest, if it is covered by the legislation, and for the reasonable price. It is very similar. My freedom ends whether I am touching your freedom or the freedom of the others. And I miss such normal, some simple, but at the same time so courageous statements of our leaders, of our politicians. Because we are afraid of people. We want only to be elected and then re-elected. And we do everything in our power just to be nice, smooth, and positive. In normal life, it is impossible. In our families, it is just impossible. Sometimes you have to adopt something not nice. I have 2 grandchildren of 2 years, you can imagine. I want to be only beautiful grandfather, but I realize that I am not always right. So political leadership is something which I miss in this discussion. Yes, the question is very sensitive. To find out the clever, rational balance between restrictions and the freedom. But I believe that in normal society, and thanks God, our democracies are normal societies. It is possible to manage it.
But why politicians, tell it in English, but why, also warum sind, glauben Sie, Politik?
But why do you think that politicians, why do we have to require leadership from politics? Is it just because we think from election to election, or is it because leadership is unpopular?
That the leadership can be popular. I am very sorry now to state that I got the highest number of person after 8 years of running my country. I got the best results, and I did bloody reforms, pensions, healthcare, social issues, flat tax implementation, and many huge, massive privatization. So it was very difficult, but my personal experience says that it is paying off if you are strong, if you promote action, because people are not stupid. People can forgive you a mistake, but what people do not forgive you is laziness or your maneuvering just to avoid responsibility and action. So my direct answer to your question is yes. Democracy, unfortunately, has some limits. One of these limits is that we have elections every 4 years, and the opposition is fighting. Opposition is using every instrument. In my time...
Wäre alle 8 Jahre besser? Would be it better 8 years ago?
I don't think so. Maybe 4 or 5, but we will go to the same problem maybe after 8 years. I'm not sure. Maybe yes, maybe 7 years. I don't know. But the problem would stay. And we should touch upon every problem where it is. In this case, it is leadership. It is responsibility of our leaders. And I see this as a global phenomenon. Look at the United States. Look at the UK. I stop here now because I should go to Germany or some other countries.
Okay. Vielen Dank. Ich habe jetzt...
Thanks a lot. Now I've heard by our directors that we have now a live connection with President Tzitsikostas. He is governor of the region North Macedonia.
Hello. Do you hear us?
I hear you.
Okay, fine.
And I'm really happy.
Meine Frage an Sie ist...
To you is... was the significance of the region decreased during the pandemic? So did it decrease the significance, this importance of regions?
I would like to say that it's my real honor to participate in this 17th Salzburg Europe Summit, which is organized by a very prestigious institute, the Institute of the Regions of Europe, who has been doing fantastic work. And I want to thank particularly Chairman Franz Schausberger, one of the most experienced and the most honored members of our committee, the Committee of Regions, for his kind invitation, his warm hospitality. I was in Salzburg 2 days ago. I must admit, dear friends, that I found the discussion and the local dialogue that we organized in Salzburg 2 days ago particularly interesting and motivating. It was one of the first dialogues with citizens that was organized by the European Committee of Regions after the outburst of this pandemic. And I really believe that it represents a step forward both for democracy and for the freedom in Europe. A step forward for democracy, because we are not talking about the people, we are listening to the people and their needs. So a step forward for freedom, because after almost 18 months of extraordinary but necessary measures, the European fundamental values of free movement and cooperation are being reinstated, showing that these values are not only deeply rooted in our European identity, but they are also our guiding principles for building a strong and resilient future of Europe. So, ladies and gentlemen, the threats to EU values and fundamental rights existed long before the pandemic and will continue to exist the day after as well. And we can all agree that the pandemic affected everyone, but some more than others, exposing inequalities between member states, regions, cities, and discrimination against women, people with disabilities, and young people, amongst others. And the lesson that is to be learned by the pandemic, but also by the severe summer floods and fires, is that no one alone can address the challenges that are lying ahead of us. All levels of government, EU, national, regional, and local, must work together in coordination and in respect of the principle of subsidiarity. Climate emergency, digital transformation, education and culture, EU's unprecedented budget and recovery plan, they will all work only if regions and cities are involved both in planning and implementation. And the Conference on the Future of Europe, which started, will only succeed if it goes beyond Brussels, beyond Strasbourg and the city and the member state capitals. Trust is the means not only to pull us through the crisis, but also to make the European democracy and freedom values even stronger. And the regionally and locally elected leaders are the most trusted level of government today. All across Europe, people want a union that is closer and proactive, and a democracy that delivers. And this is how I see the European House of Democracy. The EU being the protective roof, the member states, the strong walls, and the regions and cities, its solid foundations. We do not need another top-down approach, because centralization is not the answer. The answer is to respond to the real needs of people in the places where they live, where they work. So only by applying a bottom-up approach for Europe can succeed and rebuild citizen support in their hearts and minds. And to respond specifically to your question, I would say that regions and cities were strengthened during the pandemic, because it is not a secret that at the beginning of the crisis, when everything started, the European Union was not there to coordinate the efforts. Of course, at a later stage, it was the European Union who made it possible for us to tackle this crisis through the vaccines, through the unprecedented recovery funds that have been allocated to regions and cities and states. But it is the regions and cities who at the very beginning of the crisis were there in the front line, fighting this pandemic, strengthening the hospitals, helping out the SMEs not to close, and saving lives and positions of work. So I would say that regions, cities, through this pandemic and through this crisis, just as in all crises that have happened during this decade in Europe, have been in the front line giving a response to the question, how can Europe build a stronger future? How can Europe get closer to its citizens? Only if regions and cities are strengthened and only if they participate really in the decision-making processes, in the planning and the implementation of programs and funds like the recovery funds. This is how we will have shift recovery. This is how we will get Europe back to its feet and all the citizens stronger after this crisis. Thank you very much.
Mr. Dzurinda sagte zuvor, er vermisst.
Mr. Dzurinda said he is missing leadership in policy. Mr. Tzitzikostas, do you see it also like that? Is there a missing leadership during the crisis? Did you understand the question? Is there not enough leadership? Are there not enough strong leaders during the crisis? On all levels, on all levels.
Yes, I would agree. I would agree that there was a lack of leadership. There was a lack of coordination at the very beginning. Europe reacted, but at the beginning, as you know, competencies for health issues lie basically on member states. So we did not see the reaction that we wanted to see in many countries. Greece, for example, was an exception. There was a shift reaction, and that's why the first wave especially was dealt in a very positive and very constructive way, successfully. However, we saw a lack of leadership. But what is important is that this lack of leadership in national governments was taken over, if you want, by the leadership in regions and cities. And that's why I told you at the beginning that even though there was a lack of coordination in many countries of the European Union, the regions and cities, the regional and locally elected politicians were the one who were in the front line giving this fight in order to make sure that the hospitals were working well, that they were strengthened with hospital instruments, that they had the money to allocate in order to have more personnel for nurses and doctors. It was the regions and the cities who made sure that the digital transformation needed to move quicker in order to have education during the lockdowns, to have services to the citizens during the confinements. And it was the regions and the cities who made sure at the beginning that there was a program to help and support small and medium enterprises. Here in Central Macedonia, in my region, we allocated 200 million euros to support SMEs during this crisis, the health crisis, and another 80 million in order to support our hospitals, to save lives and support our citizens. So yes, but there was a lack of leadership, if you want, in many cases, but this lack of leadership was covered by the regionally and locally elected politicians. And this is exactly why I tell you that we need to envisage the future of Europe by strengthening the role of cities and regions, who are the actors who can bring finally Europe closer to its people.
Mr. Tzitzikostas, vielen Dank.
Mr. Tzitzikostas, thanks a lot. And you also used a key word, which is typical for a think tank. We used the word leadership. And I really have to ask now, why are politicians so afraid of leadership? Maybe you mix leadership with undemocratic behavior. Yeah, it's good to use clear words. Leadership, yes, but And here I really, I think, protect a little bit. I defend the responsible persons. In a situation like this, you are depending on the expert experience and the knowledge of specialists. And there is a kind of cacophony so far. It's not the case that all epidemiologists had the same opinion. Was there in the science a uniform opinion? No, it's the same with legal experts. You have two legal experts, you have three opinions. And that at a certain time you have to depend on a certain group of specialists. And the next discussion will start soon. Do we need a third vaccination? And if yes, when? How long does the second vaccination last? How long will it be valid? Everybody has a vaccination certificate. I have a Belgian one. And the next question will be, and I hope we will succeed, well, leadership and a compromise on a European level, or at least have a decision on a European level, because that's what citizens expect. They expect us to make a clear decision. Do we need a third vaccination, yes or no? And when we need it, when should we have this vaccination? Now we cannot say that there are lacking vaccines. We have the vaccines, but now we need a decision. When do we need a third vaccination? And this indeed is something where I hope that we will find a decision now in the near future, because the 6 months after the last vaccination is going to an end now. Maybe we find a decision that you are protected by vaccination not by 6 months, but by 9 months or by 12 months. But we need now a scientific opinion based on which political decisions can be made. And I cannot add anything else. Also, during that discussion, when we analyze the situation now in the future, then we will see what can be done on a European level and what can be done only on a national or regional level. And I think we should not just exaggerate. Also, as a budget commissioner who is responsible for the next budget, will not be responsible for the next budget 28, but you cannot always shift competences to the European level without having an appropriate budget. I think the regions understand the situation. In many countries, they received competences, but they did not receive the appropriate budget for these competences. So this has to go together. But again, subsidiarity, things should be decided on the level where it makes sense, where it is most appropriate. Also, because the knowledge is there, is on that level. And especially many things, especially in the health sector, there I agree it is the national and the regional level which should decide health sectors. Third vaccination, let's speculate a little bit without mentioning certain figures. Italy will say after 7 months we have to be vaccinated. Austria says after 9 months. Wouldn't that be a great mistake? That's why I'm so glad that the COVID coordination is also on the agenda of the Slovenian presidency. It is right, we have to rely on scientists, but sooner or later we have to make the decisions on a political level, what is recommended, and we have to coordinate on a European level. And this is happening now. This is happening much more than at the beginning of the crisis. And if we look back, then we have to say at the beginning we were all in a kind of shock, also in Europe during the first weeks. we didn't hear so much from Europe. And that's not because I want to find fault with Brussels or Strasbourg. No, because we all did not know the dimensions. And that's why I think it is important that health issues, safety issues have to stay on a national level. Depending on the country, there must be the appropriate reactions. And I do not agree with the statement that leadership is lacking or that people are afraid of leadership. But I agree with G.O. Hahn. Leadership has to be on the level where there are the competences, where you can approach people. And that one of the most important lessons learned from this crisis is Europe starts on the local level, where problems are really solved, where people have a direct partner to approach. But of course, European issues are also interfering. A lot of local decisions could not be made without Europe. And the conference Future of Europe is very important. But now, at the end of the crisis, it is important to consider all the learnings, to reflect the experiences, and we should stop considering us small. Europe is not small, and we are not incapable working in this global competition. Yes, we start with the small communities, we start with the local level, then we go to the province level, and then to the national level, and then to European level. And this has to be coordinated, this coordinated action. After the first 6 months after the last vaccination are gone. Now we talk about the third vaccination. Some say it's very urgent. Some say it might be a later vaccination. Will be there a uniform regulation? Can we avoid that the Italians vaccinate after 6 months and the Germans after 9 months? Yes, I think it is too early to predict if there will be a uniform regulation, but at least there is a coordination on a European level in the Council and also on the level of the national governments and the head of governments. And then, of course, decisions will be made on the level of the Council. And there is a consequence of the fact that the competences are on the level of the national states. And it's good that we have similar regulations. But just to exclude that there will be different regulations is not possible. Of course, we have different epidemiological estimations or councils on a national level, and we have no European epidemiologist on a real European level. We only have them on a national level. Here we still have to work. And of course, the levels have to be coordinated among themselves. They have to communicate among themselves. So at least we, as the presidency in Slovenia, we try at least to have certain plans for fighting different crises. What we have seen, there are different levels. A lot of competences are on different levels, cannot be compared with each other. A situation in one country cannot be compared with the situation of the other country. And at least, for example, these plans of fighting crisis, of taking measures, must be coordinated. But do you see a chance, and I ask this quite naive, do you see a chance to bring all these competences of the different countries on one level? No, I don't think that's the main issue presently. We have seen where where are the negative consequences when countries have different measures? We have seen that the internal market in Europe was suffering because of the restrictions of free movement. Of course, internal market, European market is a European competence, and when we fight with a crisis, at the same time, we must guarantee that this internal market will work. And for that reason, we need these plans to fight with the crisis, which must be accepted before the crisis. And according to these plans, the different levels can communicate with each other. And this, let's say, this strengthening of competences on a European level is not the main target and will not improve the situation. We have to find ways how these competences, how the levels which have competences can communicate with each other in real time and can coordinate their measures. And decisions which must be made only on a European level must be really taken on this level. I think that's the main issue, and I assume that we have learned a lot in that crisis, and that we can have now this self-awareness that we know what we are able to do, and I hope that we will be more resistant now. Maybe a very concrete example. Well, I think on a European level it is possible to coordinate if we need a third vaccination and how long the immunization lasts after the second vaccination. But on the other hand, in every country we have a different health system. And a uniform regulation when you have an incidence of 200, and just to say you have to use that and that measure when you have an incidence of 200 is not right. Why not? Today we know it's not deciding how much cases per 1,000 inhabitants you have, but it's important to know what are the consequences for the health system. How many beds do I have? How many beds of intensive care have I available? And this is different in every country. When you have a lot of beds for intensive care in a country, this country might allow a higher incidence, a higher number of cases per 1,000 inhabitants. A country which does not have enough beds must take measures earlier. And that's where I really do not want a European decision. You have really to differentiate what makes sense to do it on a European level and where are there certain regional and local differences which have to be considered. Then you have to take certain measures on a local or national level, and you should not change that because this is a really peculiarity of the European map, because here we have differences.
May I ask Mr. Tzitzikostas?
So Mr. Tzitzikostas also had to once say, Mrs. Edtstadler, you also said, do we need uniform competences? Is this really wise? No, we do not need uniform competences, but what we need is coordinated action on a European level. Then this is considered leadership, and there is one example. This is the exit strategy. You remember, borders were crossed, merchandise could not pass, and there was a short time chaos. And then there was an exit strategy of the European Commission, and everybody stick to it. When can I open again? When can I transport merchandise? What are the measures in the regions? How can I make sure that there's trust again? And I agree with the president of the of the council, the personal relations on a local, on a national level should be promoted. For example, during the lockdown, we also started to have an exchange with certain regions in the Czech Republic. We had video conferences between these bordering areas because there were some rumors that there were very high incidences. But if there is no communication, you have no trust. You must understand the living conditions of your neighbors. You need personal relations. And then I agree with Mikuláš, you need a coordinated action. You have to discuss this in the council, and that's what we are doing. And we did it last Tuesday with Gašper, and we also discussed how can we increase vaccination rates, what are the success factors in different
May I just
life.
ask, exit strategy, this keyword, why isn't this being taken as a leadership question? But I have a question, an answer here. If something is working well, it's of course natural thing. The European soul, yes. Well, if something is working well, yes, it has to be like that. And if it does not work, then people start lamenting themselves. But things that work very well, just put them on stage and tell them that it's work. Not everything worked perfectly. Think back of March, my travel to Stockholm, where 1 month later we were sitting in the lockdown, and there was this false estimate. It did not work perfectly, but many things worked perfectly. Procurement of vaccine, development, then procurement. The Green Pass at the beginning of the year. I was also in Berlin, I was in Paris, I was in Ljubljana. I promoted this green certificate, and at the beginning there were also skeptical glances, because if there's not enough vaccines, there's an inequality. And then, of course, we need this consent. In March, the Commission then issued it via an audit directive. It was decided, and in summer we traveled. Yes, of course, there are different certificates with regard to the vaccination, but I can enter it in the certificate, and I can see it with the QR code. Who is the European Union? That's us. We created it together to deal with this crisis. Thank you very much. Mr. Tzitzikostas, are you still connected? Yeah. We can't see you, but you wanted to state something.
I totally agree with Commissioner Hahn on what he said earlier, because we see today in all across Europe, we have different epidemiological situation depending on the region, depending on the city, and sometimes depending on a village. We might have cases, high cases in one region, and in the right next region, not so much, within the same country. So it is true that we cannot implement same measures all across Europe at the same time. But what we need to do, and what we need to see for future crises, is that we need better coordination from the European Union. For example, closing borders is not a response to crisis, because we saw that many countries chose to close borders at the beginning of this crisis. This is not the answer for a union, for a family of countries and member states. What we need was and is more coordination from the European Union. And of course, when it comes to health, we saw how important it is for the European Union to have competencies as well. Not only member states, because as rightly said earlier, there are member states with good leadership. For example, Austria did a fantastic job, or other countries in the European Union as well. But there are some others who lack leadership. And it's exactly where we saw the role of regional governors, presidents of regions, mayors, trying to fill this gap, if you wish. But in any case, what is needed mostly, and State Secretary Edtstadler said that earlier as well. We need good coordination. And this is what, in my opinion, should be learned from this crisis most above everything, along, of course, the fact that we cannot discuss on a future of Europe, on a Europe that will be strong and will be close to its citizens, without increasing the role of cities and regions, of municipalities and regions.
Ja, vielen Dank.
Yes, thank you very much. I wanted to proceed one step further. I wanted to ask Mrs. Siegl. At the beginning, there was this criticism: democracy is at stake, is at risk, and everything is being exploited. Can we evidence this with figures? Only in my view, as an opinion researcher, how is it seen from by the population? The majority does not see it like that, but particularly these movements against these measures, which also were fused into a party in Upper Austria. They see this, they see it like this very much. I evaluated the motives of the election, and with the MSG. With the MFG, it was the strongest response. The basic and freedom rights are being exploited. It goes away from democracy towards dictatorial situations. In the view of these people, yes, because in this corona management, we can't take everybody with us. There are groups who do not want this development. There are groups who feel themselves restricted more than others by these measures. And we also, I think, have to have a certain understanding. Take sole mothers, maybe 3 children going to school and have to work from home. They have to learn and do homework with the children. Of course, this is a burden is different than those of others. Is it a dictatorship of a silent minority, or the attempt, the anti-democratic action? It's rather the cry for a return to the state, to the status as it was before the crisis. These limitations of freedom which we had up to now could not be imagined before the pandemic, that children cannot go to school, that you must not leave your home. So that's a call for such urgency measures do not exist anymore, so that we return to the normal life as we had it before. I wouldn't see this as an anti-democratic movement. I wouldn't misunderstand it like that. MFG, they are not a dictatorial movement. It's a party that was elected democratically. We need not agree with it, but it does not wish for a coup d'etat, but it appears with democratic means, and they want a return to the status before the pandemic. That brings me to, we've heard the vaccination is the game changer. We've heard also this question, and how do you deal with those who are not vaccinated in a democratic environment? Because you could say in a totalitarian state, of course, I could say those who are not vaccinated remain at home.
The people they have no vaccine, yeah, have to be at home. That is anti-democratic. In totalitarian system, it's okay.
Well, when I was speaking about leadership, I wanted to speak about this phase, not at the first steps of the pandemic or the crisis, because more or less I have been satisfied relatively. Also, maybe in my home it was more confusion, but at the European level, at the end of the day, we had common procurement. We have decided to go for green pass. Common vaccine procurement. So all these issues were fine. But I give you one example, and this is related to your question. I'm not sure whether the fashionable trend to organize different lotteries in order to get people vaccinated is a good news. My prime minister or many other prime ministers, they are very, very reluctant, even afraid to tell people, hey, people who get vaccinated should enjoy higher freedom than people that are refusing to get vaccinated. In Slovakia, it is impossible to listen to that. And I have really serious doubts that this is the best modus operandi how to spend money of responsibles that get vaccinated. So now it is a big scandal in my home related to these lotteries when people, it doesn't matter whether they are or they are not getting vaccinated, can gain a lot of money in these lotteries. And the result is very questionable. It doesn't work. So when I'm calling for more courageous leadership, I am focused on these issues to help people to understand that if I have been vaccinated, I can enjoy higher freedom to enter a restaurant, to enter public events, different expositions. So I am in shock, and mostly I'm speaking about my country.
But leadership is to make decisions. Also,
the leadership...
one moment. 70% in the European Union are vaccinated. What have we do with the 30%, the rest?
To shout at them, not to plead them. To argue, every day to argue. What I mean is a courageous leadership is not only a decision-making process.
Okay.
Leadership means also a courageous speech, full of arguments. And every second day if needed. Why do we need to get vaccinated? Why you are either crazy or doing for the sake of your oppositional political sake. I miss heavily. It is very difficult to talk about situation in Austria or in some other countries. So 90% of my experience come from my home. And I miss a lot such a discussion, such statements of the political leaders. The president, the prime minister, the healthcare minister, the speaker, the president of the House, of the parliament. So we should argue. And we not only argue, but at the end of the day, the conditions for people who get vaccinated should be much more friendly than for those who are only refusing to get vaccinated. So they should feel it, not only to listen to the arguments, but at the end of the day to ask themselves, oh, is it really so difficult to get vaccinated? It is free of charge. It is a question of 15 minutes. It is very comfortable to get vaccinated. I am 66. I hate medicines. I know only aspirin, thanks God, so far. But for me, it is very difficult to understand why we are afraid to tell people, hey, are you crazy or stupid or just this is a question of sabotage?
The same question to you, Mr. Dovžan. Was sollen wir tun mit den 30?
What should we do with the 30% of the rest of the population who do not want to get vaccinated? Something has to happen in Austria. Is it the question 2G, 3Gs, or maybe 2Gs and a test? I think the question is very difficult to answer. That has a solution has to be found in every state. Slovenia, for example, has shown leadership. The government and legislative leadership can also be mined by fake news or opposition activities, counter-arguments that exploit the situation to draw profit on this situation and shatter the government, and also by the courts. For example, in Slovenia, the legal basis were found to violate constitution. The legal basis for all the measures in the act for the fight against the pandemic. And after this decision, a mandatory mask, etc., was shuttered. And if an inspector does not request a fine or impose a fine, we can have this leadership, but if it can't be implemented because the judiciary or others do not go along this decision, and here leadership is undermined. I think here in the European Union there will be an exchange, and every state has to decide for themselves. In Slovenia, for example, the employer, since they are responsible to provide a secure labor environment, that the employers and the government as an employer for the public service, they only have only allows 2G as from the 1st of October. And this will also be difficult because there will be consequences. And it was done what Mr. Dzurinda said. It was tried to create this leadership. But how this can be implemented in practice, we'll have to wait and see. In any case, this leads to confrontations. We have protests. At first, there were once a week. Now there are two variants. The more aggressive ones on Wednesday and the others on Friday. So it's not so easy to exercise this leadership. May I ask? The point is the crucial point: dealing with vaccinated and non-vaccinated people. The question is, we have to evaluate freedom or life. May I start? I don't see a contradiction with people that have recovered and those who are vaccinated. At present, we have enough vaccines. To everybody, we can offer this to everybody, also free of charge. And it's respectfully dealing with that. If somebody does not want to vaccinate, and they can't expect that they are protected more than their own group. And also stated this in an interview some time ago. So there is this trend towards less Gs because these 3 Gs. I also stated this. The idea was that nobody is being treated unequally under the prerequisite that we don't have enough vaccine. Now the situation is different. And maybe just one reflection as Mikuláš, I quite agree with you. Communication, of course, is very important, also in connection with leadership. But it's not that simple to stay there, to get up there and tell those that are posted with facts, which are really false facts. It's very difficult to argue against these matters. The more stupid the theory, the more difficult it is the more is it difficult to overcome it. And we also see that the social media have a massive, also negative role here, because people who are already convinced that the vaccination is bad and that a lot of bad things happens when you are vaccinated, they build up their echo chambers, as we call them, so their own opinion is being re-echoed also by algorithms. Because they want to see where the interest is. And it will not be sufficient, even if it's the President of the Republic says every other day it's our task to get vaccinated. But of course we have to do it. We must continue doing so. but the lower the level is, the threshold is for access to vaccination, but also the argumentation. If the mayor, the parish priest, or the teacher in the village again and again explains that it is important to get vaccinated, then it will be more. And nobody has said that democracy is simple, but it is worth, in the sense of democracy, to fight for it.
Well, democracy is not easy. That's why we start now already with the concluding round. The figures say this democracy is quite stable. There is a small minority, well, 80% compared to 12%. Only these 12% are anti-democratic or an anti-democratical group. Commissioner Hahn, how will we go on? Yeah, you do not know who will win in the lottery during the next 6 months, but how can we continue? How will we continue in this pandemic craziness? Well, in Austria, we still have to vaccinate a few persons. We only have 60%. On a European level, we have 70%. In Denmark, more than 80%. How will we continue? I'm proud. The employees of the European Commission are vaccinated up to 94%. Well, this is also maybe based on information. When you are working in an international business, you want to move, you want to travel, and that's no discussion. But let's state from behind the question of communication. Well, in some groups, you have the rumor, you hear the rumor that vaccination is having an effect on fertility. And I think that you have to say in public, this is stupid. And I'm sure it is stupid, and the scientists will confirm that. And this will make a contribution. Maybe one or the other will think about it. The second thing is, I talked with a friend, I still call in, he is a verbal anarchist, and he told me he will not be vaccinated because all the others say you should be vaccinated. He's always doing the opposite what people say. And he's also the one going on the wrong direction on the highway. And I told him I would think about my opinion, because just the attitude to protect yourself is getting decreasing. Before that, I was disinfecting my hands 5 times a day. Now I'm doing it not so often, and I shake hands with people again, out of a feeling sooner or later people will get used to things. People will think they are protected. Maybe this is a mistake, but the ones who are not vaccinated, they have so more risk. And the last thing is vaccination obligation, yes or no. According to my feeling, I think you should not talk about an obligation, but the social pressure should be increased. And you said already, if you are not able to go to a restaurant anymore because I'm not vaccinated or tested, then sooner or later the situation will improve. But there is, it's another example, on a national, on a regional level, there is a difference. In Italy, the Premier Minister or the government has introduced an obligation, and they said if you are not vaccinated, you will lose your job. And this has dramatically increased the vaccination rate. But I assume, well, I assume it worked, because in Italy, Italy was affected very severely by this pandemic. People died nearly in every family, and so people were more prepared to accept that. But the Italians say our way is a good way. Why doesn't Austria do that, or the European Union? Because I told you there are different experiences in a population, and I could give you a lot of experiences. And that's the charming thing of Europe. We say we are united in a variety. We have different experiences. And again, We should identify the areas, the fields where we can choose a mutual attitude. For example, do we need a third vaccination, yes or no? How long do scientists consider the immunization of this vaccination? Well, we have already a European work commission, and then maybe they will find a mutual solution. But there are also certain issues. I've mentioned it already. For example, the incidence, the number of sick persons per 1,000 persons have to be considered and appreciated differently in the different countries. I assume during the next weeks and months, we will have more and more normalization. The new challenge is the global vaccination, because there we are only at the beginning. And here Europe really tries to go ahead. So we have exported vaccinations, as many as we have used already in Europe. It's 700 million. Now the Americans have joined us, so I think there will be a certain boost for the global level. And what we did not discuss, the effects to the global economy, the effects on the European situation. We have different areas where we have difficulties to supply material, not only the chips, also construction material and so on. We have a beginning inflation. We do not yet know how sustainable this will be. So we have a lot of, well, let's say, additional effects which must be also discussed and which have their effects. And I do not now discuss the question what that means for our future labor life. Well, but as a commissioner, I can tell you the hybrid working mode will be the normality. People will work in home office, will sometimes go to the office. There will be a certain effect on public transport, on city planning. So altogether, I'm sure in a certain time we will find out that the pandemic has led to very strict and very strong effects on our cohabitation, on our cooperation, and we have overcome the pandemic. I'm sure then the consequences will be also positive. Thanks, Commissioner Hahn. The learnings out of that crisis. We are also discussing Europe post-corona. What are the learnings from your point of view? Well, I think we have seen that Europe is functioning, is working, and that most problems in Europe could be settled easier on a mutual base. Well, there are two things. Well, the internal market will dissipate, will not work if you have closed borders. And this is an achievement which should be protected, this internal market. We have to have plans for fighting future crises in order to keep that achievements also during the next crisis. Well, this is one thing. And the third issue is we have also seen that we can learn a lot from each other, and we must learn from each other, and that we must know our own strengths better from the very beginning, especially when we speak about our relation not only with the citizens but also with third countries. I think especially when we think about the situation on the Western Balkans at the beginning, we did not really succeed to communicate our support, our achievements. And some could use this also against the European Union. And this is also a learning. when we talk about fighting with future crises, we have to be very careful. What are the consequences for the neighboring countries? What can we do in order to make neighboring countries more resilient? How can we communicate our achievements better?
I think that we should operate in 3 areas in the near future when it comes to the pandemic and our lesson learned. The first is the pharmaceutical industry. I am not sure whether Johannes or somebody else have already spoken this issue, because I lost for a while translation. But it is clear that we need to enjoy higher independence and stronger resilience when it comes to the critical medicines. It is spoken already at the European level, and I believe that it is possible to achieve such a goal, not to depend on China, for instance, or some other countries which can play a geopolitical games. And this is the question number 2. When it comes to the countries such as China or Russia, but even the United States, we need to speak with one voice. I am not against Sinovac. I am not against Sputnik. There was a big scandal in my home. I am really not against these medicines. But sometimes, not seldom, I had a feeling that these vaccines are using as well, or used as a geopolitical weapon to implement a traditional approach, divide et impera, divide and rule tactics. We should trust our European institutions, including the European Medicines Agency. If the vaccine can enjoy certificate, okay. If not, we should trust our people. So this is the issue of number 2. And last but not least, there is also the issue which I can describe as the need to effectively invest into civic society, NGOs, and to work with the public. But I believe we have already spoken this issue, because the space is full of disinformation, propaganda, crazy statuses, or fake news, as one known politician used to say. So we have to invest into civic society, into our NGOs, in order to help them to cooperate on the ground, to meet people directly, to listen to them, and to offer rational arguments to them. So for me, for the moment, these 2 areas are available for improvement, not speaking about issues which have already been discussed. Subsidiarity. This is a miraculous instrument. I lived many decades under Czechoslovak Federation. And I remember very well what does it mean if you are given the competencies, or you build democracy from bottom to up, and you give competencies to the Central Union. The more I think about the pandemic, the more I believe that we should change this area and to make healthcare as the area of shared competencies. Something should be kept on the municipal and regional level. Some competencies should not be touched at the national level, but I am sure there are areas in which the competencies should be entrusted to the communitarian level. I believe at the end of the day, maybe also the constitution will be changed, not only because of the pandemic, not only because or due to the healthcare. We have some other businesses on the table as well.
Ein neues Fass aufmachen, nämlich die
Yeah, well, the constitution, to open a constitution, that means opening a new field of discussion, maybe for the next summit. Mr. Minister, ladies and gentlemen, thanks a lot for your discussion. I hope we could give you some input now to everybody who is listening to us, so that in the next break, which will be a networking break, we can continue our discussions. Thank thank you for your time. Thank you for your willingness to exchange opinions. I wish you a nice morning.